There is a particular kind of silence that follows you home. Not the silence of a quiet room, but the silence of a person who has learned, slowly and painfully, that most people cannot hold the weight of who they truly are. You have sat across from someone and felt, in the deepest chamber of your chest, the slow ache of being seen only on the surface. You have explained yourself, you have softened your edges, you have translated your depth into something smaller, something digestible, something that would not frighten the people who were never built to understand you. And still, it was never enough. From the perspective of psychology, there is a profound reason certain people move through the world feeling like strangers in rooms full of familiar faces. It is not dysfunction. It is not damage. It is the weight of individuation, the rare and often lonely process of becoming fully, authentically, and unapologetically whole. Most people never complete this journey. Most people choose the mask over the mirror. And so when someone like you, someone who has walked through their own darkness, who has sat with their own shadows, who has refused the comfortable lie, enters a room, something shifts. Something unconscious stirs in the people around you, something they cannot name. What you are about to hear is not a lesson. It is a recognition. It is the quiet voice of your own inner world, finally speaking back to you. Stay with it. The truth you are about to meet has been waiting a long time. There is something that happens inside a person who has done real inner work. And it is not what most people expect. It is not confidence in the way the world celebrates it. It is not the loud, self-assured presence that commands a room with noise. It is something quieter than that, something more unsettling. It is the steady, unshakable quality of a person who no longer needs the room to validate them. And paradoxically, it is precisely this quality that makes the room unable to look away. Psychology has long studied the phenomenon of what happens when a psychologically developed individual enters the orbit of someone who has not yet done their inner work. The developed person, the one who has descended into their own darkness, who has faced the parts of themselves that were ugly and wounded and afraid, who has integrated those parts rather than projecting them outward. This person carries a frequency that is fundamentally different from the collective noise around them. They do not perform peace, they possess it. And to a person who has never experienced genuine inner stillness, that possession is both magnetic and terrifying. You have been called too much, too intense, too serious, too difficult to understand. And somewhere along the way, perhaps in the quiet of a night that felt too long, you began to wonder if those accusations were true. If the weight you carried was a flaw rather than a feature, if the depth you felt in every human interaction was a burden you were destined to apologize for. This is the first wound that psychology asks you to examine. Not the wound of being too much, but the wound of believing them when they said you were. The shadow, in the language of the unconscious mind, is not simply darkness. It is everything we were told to hide. It is the grief we swallowed in childhood because someone needed us to be fine. It is the intelligence we dimmed because it made others uncomfortable. It is the sensitivity we armored because the world rewarded hardness over depth. Every part of yourself you were asked to suppress did not disappear. It descended. It went underground. And in its underground form, it became the very thing that makes you magnetic, the unspoken density, the gravitational pull, the sense that standing near you means standing near something real. A shallow man, and here we speak not of cruelty, but of psychological underdevelopment. A shallow man encounters a woman of real depth and feels immediately destabilized. Not because she has done anything wrong, not because she has demanded anything of him, but because her presence, her stillness, her refusal to perform smallness acts as a mirror, and in that mirror he is forced to see everything he has avoided in himself, the parts of his own psyche he has not visited, the emotional territories he has bypassed on his way to building an identity that looked acceptable from the outside. This is the psychological root of why depth intimidates those who have not cultivated it. It is not about you being too much. It is about them having too little self-knowledge, too little inner encounter, too little tolerance for the kind of silence that asks questions rather than fills space. When he looked at you and felt confused, it was not your confusion he was experiencing. It was his own reflection, arriving uninvited. And yet, the cruelty of this dynamic is that you were the one who suffered for it. You were the one who left conversations feeling faintly wrong, slightly misunderstood, quietly erased. You were the one who translated, simplified, compressed yourself into something smaller so that the connection would not break. And the tragedy, the real psychological tragedy, is that every time you made yourself smaller to fit a smaller space, you confirmed in yourself the lie that you were the problem, that your depth was the obstacle, that your wholeness was what needed to change. It did not, it does not, it never will. What psychology asks you to understand, slowly, without rushing toward comfort, is that the experience of being too deep for a shallow world is not a wound. It is a marker. It is the evidence that your individuation has progressed further than those around you. It is the painful, beautiful signal that you are no longer operating from the unconscious scripts that govern most human behavior. You have woken up inside your own life. And waking up, as anyone who has done it knows, is a profoundly lonely experience at first. The loneliness does not mean you are broken. The loneliness means you have arrived somewhere real. And the first step of this journey is learning to stand in that place without apologizing for the view. There is a concept buried deep in the architecture of the unconscious mind, a concept that explains more about the collapse of certain relationships than any surface-level conversation about compatibility ever could. It describes an internal image that every person carries, shaped in the earliest years of life, formed from the first encounters with tenderness and disappointment, with closeness and abandonment, with being held and being let go. This image, this inner figure, is the template through which we encounter the people who move us most deeply. And it is in the light of this template that we must understand why a certain kind of man, when he encounters a certain kind of woman, finds himself both irresistibly drawn toward her and fundamentally incapable of remaining. He was drawn to you for reasons he could not articulate, not because of appearance, though that may have been the first language of the attraction, but because of something he sensed beneath appearance, a quality of being that felt both familiar and beyond reach. The sense that standing near you meant standing near something he had always been looking for, without knowing he was looking. This is the signature of an encounter that operates at the level of the unconscious, not chemistry in the modern trivial sense of the word, but recognition. Deep, cellular, ancient recognition. And here is where the psychology becomes painful, because the same recognition that drew him toward you is precisely what made him unable to stay. The parts of yourself that activated his deepest longing, your emotional honesty, your refusal to perform comfort that you did not feel, your ability to sit in silence without needing to fill it, your capacity to see through pretense and speak from a place of real feeling. These are the very qualities that confronted him with everything he had not yet become. And rather than respond to that confrontation with curiosity, rather than allow it to initiate the difficult and necessary process of his own growth, he responded the way most unintegrated people respond to a mirror that shows them too much of the truth. He looked away. The collapse of such a relationship is rarely dramatic. It does not announce itself with honesty. It retreats. It grows quietly distant. It begins to find fault in the very things it once admired. The depth that once felt like home begins to be described as intensity. The honesty that once felt like intimacy begins to be called too much. He starts searching, consciously or not, for a space where the mirror does not ask so many questions. A space that allows him to remain comfortable within the version of himself he has always known. And you, in your willingness to hold space for his complexity, in your quiet refusal to diminish what was real between you, become the thing he both wants and cannot face. This is not cruelty. It is psychological cowardice of a very specific and very human kind. It is the retreat of a person who encountered the threshold of their own transformation, chose the familiar over the true. It is the moment when the unconscious, faced with the call to grow, chooses the sleep of avoidance over the waking of consciousness. And in this retreat, something is always left behind. Not just the relationship, but a version of the self that could have been. A version that, had he remained, had he chosen the discomfort of depth over the comfort of distance, might have finally become whole. What you must understand, and this understanding is not revenge, it is not consolation, it is simply truth, is that his inability to hold you was never a verdict on your worth. It was a revelation of his readiness. A person who has not yet descended into their own inner world cannot recognize a person who has already returned from theirs. They can feel the difference. They can feel the gravity of what you carry. But they cannot yet translate that gravity into a love that sustains rather than simply consumes. You were not asking too much of him. You were asking exactly what a soul in full presence asks, to be met completely in a place of real knowing. And the tragedy is not that you asked. The tragedy is that the asking revealed a silence where an answer should have been. Let the silence teach you. Not about your inadequacy, but about discernment. The next time a connection begins, you will feel the difference between someone drawn to the surface of your depth and someone willing to go under. That discernment is not bitterness. It is the wisdom that suffering, when it is not wasted, always leaves behind. There is a wound so deeply embedded in the psyche of the emotionally intelligent that it almost never gets named, because the wound does not look like damage from the outside. It looks like generosity. It looks like patience. It looks like the extraordinary capacity to understand another person's pain before they have even articulated it. It looks, in every external measure, like a gift. And perhaps this is why it takes so long to be recognized for what it truly is. The slow, quiet dissolution of the self in the service of someone else's comfort. Psychology speaks of this pattern, this compulsive tendency toward emotional overextension, as one of the more complex manifestations of the shadow. Not the shadow as darkness, but the shadow as the collection of everything the self learned to suppress in order to remain loved. For many people of genuine emotional depth, the early lesson was not that they were unworthy of love. It was subtler than that. The lesson was that the love available to them was conditional on their usefulness. That the warmth of connection was accessible only in proportion to how much they gave, how little they demanded, how perfectly they managed the emotional atmosphere of the people around them. And so the deep woman, the woman who feels everything, who understands instinctively what others need, who has the rare and painful gift of sitting inside another person's inner world and making it feel less frightening. This woman learned to place herself at the center of every relationship, not out of arrogance, but out of the only survival strategy she had ever been taught. She learned to be indispensable. She learned to give before she was asked. She learned to manage the emotional weather of every room she entered, to smooth the edges of other people's discomfort, to absorb, to translate, to hold, until the holding became so habitual that she forgot she was doing it. Until the giving became so automatic that she could no longer locate the boundary between what she wanted and what she believed she was obligated to provide. This is the shadow of emotional intelligence when it has not yet been integrated. The capacity for empathy, unexamined and undirected, becomes a mechanism for self-erasure. The ability to understand another's pain becomes, over time, a reason to minimize one's own. The depth that should have been a gift she gave to herself first becomes instead a resource she deploys entirely in the service of others, leaving the inner landscape perpetually depleted, perpetually waiting for a reciprocity that never quite arrives in the form she needs it. He felt this. Whatever man moved through your life and left his particular gravity in the rooms of your memory, he felt this quality in you. He felt the generosity. He felt the way you held space for the parts of him that no one else had patience for. He felt, perhaps for the first time in his life, genuinely witnessed. And rather than respond to that witnessing with the reverence it deserved, he did what people who have not examined their own shadows so often do. He consumed it. Not maliciously, not with awareness, but unconsciously, the way all hungry things consume the nourishment they encounter, without pausing to consider the cost to the one who provided it. The reckoning that psychology offers is not an indictment of your generosity. It is an invitation to turn that generosity, that extraordinary capacity for care, toward the one person who has needed it most and received it least, yourself. The shadow of overgiving cannot be healed by giving less. It can only be healed by learning to recognize your own inner landscape as equally worthy of the attention you have always lavished on others. By sitting with your own grief the way you have sat with the grief of those who loved you imperfectly. By holding space for your own complexity the way you have always held space for theirs. There is a version of you. She has always existed. She has been waiting beneath the layers of accommodation and adaptation and careful performance of availability. Who knows, in the deepest register of her being, that she is not a resource. She is a person, a full, sovereign, irreducible person. And the beginning of her emergence is the moment she stops offering her depth as though it were a service, and starts protecting it as though it were the most precious thing she has ever been given to tend, because it is. And the man who will one day deserve to encounter it will know this without being told. He will arrive at the threshold of who you are with reverence rather than appetite. And when that day comes, you will understand why every act of self-erasure, before it was, in its own painful way, preparation. There is a particular misreading that the world has always made of the woman who is comfortable alone. It interprets her solitude as lack. It reads her self-containment as damage. It assumes that the person who does not constantly reach outward must be doing so because no one is reaching back. That the stillness at the center of her life is not chosen but imposed, not cultivated but endured. This misreading is not accidental. It is cultural. It is the inevitable conclusion of a world that has confused constant connection with wholeness and mistaken the noise of company for the substance of intimacy. But solitude, in the psychological sense that matters, is not the absence of connection. It is the presence of the self. It is the rare and quietly radical act of returning, again and again, to one's own inner world. Not because the outer world has nothing to offer, but because the outer world, for all its stimulation and movement and social warmth, cannot provide what only the inner encounter can. And the woman who has learned this, who has learned to sit inside her own silence without anxiously filling it, who has learned to know her own mind without the constant mirror of another person's opinion, this woman has cultivated something that most human beings spend their entire lives avoiding the development of. He saw this in you. He saw the way you did not need him to feel complete. He saw the way your happiness was not dependent on his arrival, the way your identity did not dissolve at the edge of his presence, the way you remained, even in the intimacy between you, irreducibly yourself. And this quality, this sovereign selfhood, disturbed him in a way he likely never examined closely enough to understand, because the person who has never cultivated solitude, who has used relationship after relationship as a mirror in which to construct a self they could not construct alone, encounters the self-contained person and feels, obscurely, accused. Your wholeness made him aware of his incompleteness, not through anything you said, not through any demand you made, simply through the undeniable reality of what you were, a person who had descended into her own inner forest, who had walked among the trees of her own suffering and her own joy and her own complexity, and who had returned from that walk carrying something that could not be taken from her, something that did not need his validation to remain standing. This is what psychology recognizes as the threatening nature of true individuation. The person who has done the inner work, who has integrated their shadows, faced their wounds, cultivated the long and difficult relationship with their own unconscious. This person does not require another to be whole. They may desire connection deeply and genuinely, but desire is not dependency, and the distinction between the two is precisely what makes the individuated person so unsettling to those who have confused one for the other. What he called unavailable was actually sovereign. What he called cold was actually self-possessed. What he called distant was actually whole. And the tragedy of that misreading is that it so often convinces the woman on the receiving end that the accusation is accurate, that the very quality that represents her highest psychological development is, in fact, her greatest interpersonal failure. It is not. The capacity to be alone, truly, peacefully, productively alone, is among the rarest qualities a human being can develop. It requires the ability to sit with the full weight of one's own inner life without fleeing into distraction or noise, or the borrowed identity of another person's affection. It requires the courage to face the parts of the self that are inconvenient, unresolved, still in process, and to remain in their company without demanding they transform faster than they are capable of transforming. The woman who has developed this capacity carries something ancient and earned. She carries the quiet authority of someone who has met herself, not the performed self, not the self that others were comfortable with, but the full, unedited, complicated, luminous self, and has chosen not to abandon her. That choosing is the deepest act of self-love available to a human being, and it produces, in the person who has completed it, a stillness that no external circumstance can entirely disrupt. What he mistook for loneliness was never loneliness, it was sovereignty. And sovereignty, unlike loneliness, does not need his recognition to be real. There is a quality of encounter that occurs, rarely and without announcement, between two people. An encounter that operates so far beneath the surface of ordinary interaction that neither participant fully comprehends what is happening while it is happening. Only afterward, in the long quiet of absence, does the depth of the encounter begin to reveal itself. This is the numinous encounter, the meeting that does not merely register in memory, but rewrites something in the architecture of the unconscious. The meeting that, once it has occurred, makes every subsequent encounter feel faintly hollow by comparison, as though the world has continued moving, but the standard by which all movement is measured has permanently changed. You have been this encounter for someone. Perhaps you have known it. Perhaps you have felt it in the way certain departures seem to carry weight that ordinary endings do not carry. Perhaps you noticed it in the way he returned, not always in the physical sense, but in the smaller and more revealing ways. The message sent at an odd hour, the reference to something only the two of you shared, the quality of attention he paid you, even as he was choosing to walk away from you. These are not the behaviors of a person who has simply moved on. These are the behaviors of a person who has encountered something in another that they cannot locate anywhere else and have not yet found the psychological language to understand. The numinous imprint works like this. When a person of genuine psychological development, someone who is not performing depth but actually possessing it, not narrating authenticity but actually embodying it, enters the life of someone who has lived primarily on the surface of experience, the encounter activates something deep in the unconscious of the surface dweller. It activates, specifically, the image of what they might become, the version of themselves that has been buried beneath the accumulated accommodations and compromises and convenient self-deceptions that make ordinary life manageable. And in the presence of someone who has refused those accommodations, who has paid the full price of being real, this buried version stirs. This stirring is uncomfortable. In fact, it is among the most uncomfortable experiences available to the human psyche, because it is the experience of being shown what is possible by someone who has already made the sacrifice to achieve it. It is the experience of encountering your own unlived life in the form of another person. And most people, when they encounter their unlived life, do not respond with gratitude. They respond with the particular mixture of longing and resentment that is the signature of the shadow refusing to be integrated. He longed for the version of himself that your presence made possible. He resented the fact that accessing that version required more from him than he was prepared to give. And in the space between that longing and that resentment, something was decided, usually without full consciousness, usually in the form of a gradual withdrawal rather than a clear choice. He moved away from the encounter, but he could not move away from its residue, because the numinous imprint does not depart when the person who created it departs. It remains. It becomes the invisible standard against which all future connections are unconsciously measured. This is why, years later, in the middle of a perfectly adequate life with a perfectly acceptable person, a man who once stood in your presence and chose to walk away will feel the specific and inexplicable sensation of something missing. Not missing in an identifiable way, not missing like a forgotten object that can be retrieved, but missing in the way that something essential is missing when it has been present and then removed. Missing in the way that a person feels when they have glimpsed the interior of a life larger than the one they are currently living, and then allowed the door to close. You are not responsible for this. Your only responsibility in this entire dynamic is the one that belongs to you, the responsibility of continuing to become, of continuing the difficult, luminous, occasionally agonizing process of your own full emergence, of refusing, no matter how many times the world misreads you, or undervalues you, or fails to hold what you offer, to make yourself smaller in response. Because the imprint you leave on the people who encounter you at the depth of who you really are is not a coincidence. It is the natural consequence of a person who has refused the slow death of inauthenticity. It is the inevitable effect of a soul that has chosen wholeness over comfort, truth over convenience, depth over the approval of those who are not yet ready to swim. What he could not hold, he will never stop reaching for. And what you are building, in the quiet sovereignty of your own becoming, will outlast every hand that was not strong enough to hold it. And so we arrive here, not at the end of a story, but at the threshold of a recognition. Because what you have been listening to, beneath all the language and the metaphor and the slow unfolding of psychological truth, is simply this. You have always been the measure, not by comparison, not by competition, but by virtue of what you have chosen to become through everything the world offered you as a reason not to. You have been misread. You have been found too much and not enough in the same breath. You have stood in the middle of your own depth and been told it was a problem. And in the accumulated weight of those misreadings, there were moments, quiet, private, genuinely difficult moments, when you almost believed them. This is the final thing that psychology offers you today.